Boker Tov, everyone. One of the common themes that is woven throughout the entire Torah is that of leadership. What does a good leader look like? What does a bad leader look like? And also, how can a leader learn from their mistakes? And that's very important in the Torah, is leaders, particularly Moshe, makes mistakes. In fact, our recent guest, Rabbi Tzvi Grummet, one of his earlier books was specifically called something like Moses and Leadership. And it does just that. It looks at all of the different opportunities that Moshe had to learn from leadership and then what it could teach us. Well, in this week's Parasha, we see Moshe and us learn a lot about leadership. So one of the early incidents in this Parasha, Behaalotecha, which starts with the context of the Mishkan, again, the precursor to the temple, and it talks about the priests going up and lighting the menorah. You know, today we have the Ner Tamid, that hanging light that's always meant to be lit. Welcome, Susan. And they used to have an actual menorah. So when they would go up, Behaalotecha, to light it, that's the beginning. But then early on, we get into a narrative story where the people are complaining about meat. We want meat. And there's this whole back and forth, and Moshe gets frustrated. And oftentimes, again, something talking about leaders, it is okay for a leader to get frustrated. It's not okay for them to take it out on the people. And we do see throughout the book of Bamidbar, Moshe hitting the rock. We'll talk about that when we get there, Moshe losing his cool. And he eventually goes to God in our parasha and has this back and forth that I'll talk about a little bit more on Shabbat. But he basically says, what do? I can't handle the people. They're really getting to me. And God says, look, it's not just you. Anybody who's trying to do it alone is one person. It's too much. So I'm going to ask you to pick 70 people, and specifically it's going to be men in this context, 70 elders, leaders who are wise, to help you do it. And there's this beautiful scene when Moshe finally gets the 70 elders and he imbues them with this almost supernatural ability to essentially make decisions on behalf of God. They become mini prophets, as if Moshe has the most power of a prophet and they each have 1/70th of it. But that's enough. If somebody says, he stole my bicycle or he underpaid me at the bakery, you don't need to go to Moshe for every one of those things. Sometimes you can go to one of these 70 elders. So that's the first most important lesson, that all leaders need help. They need to delegate. They need to recognize that if they take everything on their shoulders, it will crush them and it'll come out. We've all seen leaders who try and take on too much, or parents or anybody or teachers. They take on too much and they end up lashing out at their children, teachers, etc., like that. That's very human. We understand that, but it doesn't need to get there. So that's the first important lesson. But then a peculiar little scene happens in the midst of this with two gentlemen named Eldad and Medad. And that's where our story is going to start. And the question of what is this story doing here? And what might it be trying to teach us about leadership and our ability to connect to God? So Gloria and Leonard, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you, and I'll go ahead and zoom in. And again, this first source takes part after the 70 elders go to Moshe. And by the way, as a side note, when Moshe imbued that prophetic power into those 70 elders, that is the model by which I'm a rabbi today. Now, there's not an unbroken chain, meaning the idea was that Moshe gave it to those 70. Those 70 each gave it to more, and technically speaking, there's actually like a power, like a magical power that should have been passed down from Moshe to generations. At some point, that line was broken. So it's supposed to be that a rabbi is someone imbued with that 1/1,000,000th or billionth of prophetic power. Today, it's more communal acceptance of it, but that's where this idea of passing on rabbinic responsibility and privilege, or whatever you want to call it, comes from. So I don't have magical powers. I only have the powers that you have given me, but it's a cool little connection. So now this Eldad and Medad, who are they and what's going on? So Gloria, please, from the Midbar.
Now 2 men named Eldad and Medad remained behind in the camp, and the Spirit rested upon them. They were among those who had been enrolled, but they did not go out to the tent, and they spoke in ecstasy inside the camp.
Excellent. Now there's a lot of mysteries going on here, because why are they named and the other 70 elders are not? And if you're saying, how do we know they're among the 70? There's a little bit of context here where it says they picked the 70, and then it moves on to Eldad and Medad. But there's this word here in the Hebrew. It's the second to last line, second word from the right, and it says baketuvim or baktuvim. And it says those who were written down. And it seems like Moshe had written down the names of all those who would be his leaders. God told him the list, or Moshe was inspired to write the list. But the question here is this: if 70 were chosen and written down, does that mean 70 went to Moshe, and these are numbers 71 and 72, and we need to figure out why they were extras? Or were there 70 chosen and only 68 went to Moshe? And again, even more so, why did these two think that they should stay behind in the camp? And all of these people went to Moshe to get the power of prophecy, but these two seemingly didn't go. So where did their prophetic power from? And what are they prophesying in the camp? The main prophet is Moshe. So how is it that two other guys, basically Moshe is off initiating these elders, 68 or 70, and Eldad and Medad are doing Moshe's job in his absence? I'm not saying that's exactly what's happening, but it kind of looks like that. And the person who does think that that is what is happening and is deeply troubled by it is, just one moment, Rifki, is Yehoshua. So actually, Rifki, before we read the next source, I'm unmuting you. Go ahead, you just gotta click on your side. Do you see the button? There you go. Okay, go ahead, Rifki.
The last part, it said they spoke in ecstasy.
Ecstasy inside the camp. Let's see if we can, the Hebrew here is Vayitnabu b'machane. They prophesied. I don't know why it translated. Again, this is not my translation. It's like a common, like a published one, but it's from the word.
Prophesied what?
We don't
know. Were
know.
They just excited?
We don't. So ecstasy means being outside of one's body. I believe that's the literal meaning of it. So having an ecstatic experience is as if some other force outside my body is making me do or say things. And that's what prophecy is. I am speaking the word of God. It's not coming from here in my brain or my heart. It's coming from God. So that's probably why it was translated as ecstasy. But the simple translation is they were telling prophecies. But again, Rifki, we don't know what they are. It will mention later. There's a midrashic tradition. The rabbis guess at what the three prophecies are. I think I'll only mention one and another one on Shabbat, and I could mention them all later.
So only the two were excited?
They weren't excited. That's a different word. They were having this ecstatic experience, meaning an experience outside of their own bodies. Anyone who saw them, whatever they said, everyone knew it was not them talking. It was God talking through them. So don't read ecstatic, read saying a prophecy of God. That's a much better translation. They were saying a prophecy of God. But again, the way it looks to us, as if something outside their body is making them talk, and ecstasy means outside of one's body. Again, I believe that's the literal translation. Excellent question. Always challenge the translations, but you helped us.
Thank you.
Of course. So Leonard, so as I said, they're in the camp doing prophesying. Well, Moshe is the prophet, and he's setting up people who are officially allowed to do quasi-prophecy, or really being judges. That's really their main job, is to judge common cases, so it doesn't all have to come to Moshe, or to hear the people's grievances. And if the people are saying, oh, it's too hot today, you don't have to tell Moshe. The 70 elders can say, well, turn the air conditioner on, etc. if they have one. So the one person who is not happy and says, how dare you, is Yehoshua. Joshua, who is one of the original 10 scouts who went to the land of Israel or Canaan, and he did not speak ill of the land. He said, we can definitely conquer this. And when Moshe dies, who takes over as leader of the entire people is Yehoshua. And one person said that his concern here may not be that they're trying to usurp Moshe, but Moshe is going to die, and maybe the person they're trying to usurp is him. Now that's a little bit, reading in perhaps a little bit too much. Susan had to leave. Hopefully she'll come back. But Leonard, if you could take this source, this is Yehoshua's frustration, but we learn a great deal about Moshe from his response, and then we'll dig into it. So go ahead, please, Leonard.
And Joshua, son of Nun, Moses' attendant from his youth, spoke up and said, my Lord Moses, imprison them. But Moses said to them, are you being zealous for me? I wish that the entire people of the Lord were prophets, and that the Lord would confer his spirit on them all.
Excellent, thank you. So Yehoshua, we don't know why Yehoshua is concerned here. Again, is he worried about his boss getting replaced, or is he worried that he's next in line and that maybe they'll take it away from him. Is this a power play thing? We don't know, but he does not like two people that are, again, not part of the initiation ceremony of the 70 and not Moshe prophesying in the camp. Moshe's response is, don't be so crazy, relax. Wouldn't it be nice if everybody could speak for God, if God made everybody a prophet? Now, why does Moshe say that? Because of humility, because he recognizes that there's a great burden on his shoulders and he wishes that he didn't have to be the only one. Again, we don't know, but it's such a lovely statement. He said, I wish everybody could speak for God. I wish everybody could have these ecstatic experiences, these out of your body ones where God spoke through you. Wouldn't that be cool if God spoke to everybody? And he shuts down Yehoshua. Whatever Yehoshua's concern was, Moshe says, it doesn't matter. Look on the bright side. This is actually a positive thing. He's not worried, and he doesn't need to be worried because Eldad and Medad don't usurp anybody's power. Moshe stays in power until he dies, and then when they go into the land, Yehoshua takes over completely without question and becomes one of the greatest leaders, probably in some ways, even greater than Moshe, at least as a practical leader. His prophetic power wasn't as great, but as a military leader, he was the tops. So everything works out in the end. So we don't really know what Yoshua's concern was, and we don't really know why Moshe wasn't worried, but it all works out. But there's still a big, yeah, Gloria, please.
It could be just that Moshe has enough confidence to not feel threatened.
Yeah.
He's the leader and he doesn't really think that it's against him.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, I said here, one of the lessons is about leadership. So that's one lesson about leadership is somebody who's constantly looking. I mean, we think about politics. If somebody has a 2-year term, they basically work for like a month and then they spend the rest of the time campaigning for their next election. And this isn't even like, oh, these are horrible people. That's unfortunately the way that politics works. Now, I'm not suggesting that people should be, politicians for life, but even a president has 4 years. They usually do 2 or 3 years of work, and then they spend at least a year campaigning and not focusing on doing the work. And they don't really have a choice per se until they're, a lame duck. And maybe that's one of the things here is don't be so worried about staying in power. Be worried about, people doing good, about doing their job, about inspiring others. And he sees people being inspired and says, that's what really matters at the end of the day. And I'm not worried about it because God chose me. So I think what you said is true, and there's so much. But one of the questions we're going to explore now a little bit, and it'll kind of come out in the next sources, is why did Eldad and Medad stay behind? Or why weren't they included in the 70? And from that, it'll grow out a few ideas about leadership and about what the significance of Eldad and Medad in the Torah. So the first source here, I'm not going to read inside because it's a beautiful source and it actually makes a lot of sense, because in the Torah, it says that Eldad and Medad were among those who were written down, Baketuvim. What does it mean they were written down? So what Rashi surmises, based on, I believe, an earlier midrash, is that there must have been a lottery. There were 72, maybe even more, possible candidates who could have been among the 70, who could have had that prophetic power and been good leaders for whatever. We don't know what the qualifications are, but there was plenty of men who could do it. And to be fair, Moshe, just like on Yom Kippur with the 2 goats, there's a lottery. There's lotteries all the time in the Torah for bad, like on Purim, and for good, like in this case. Moshe wanted to be fair. So he wrote down the names of everybody who could have been a possible leader, one of the 70 elders, and 70 were picked. And 2 of them that had this great potential for prophecy, but just didn't make the cut were Eldad and Medad. So they stayed behind, not as a punishment, they just didn't win the lottery, but they had all of the qualifications and capacity and ability to be leaders. So that's Rashi's take, is that there was a lottery and they just didn't make the cut. They didn't do anything wrong whatsoever. This last line here, from the Midrash that mentions this, it's in the Hebrew, Hamakom lo chafetz bach. God's presence doesn't need you. It's fine. We have enough team. What did I call this? I called it luck of the draw. But they're basically bench warmers, which will come out. I think I called that for the next source. But they're backups. They're not needed. So that's Rashi. There's 2 other ideas. One is kind of a variation on that. So in the 13th century France, and by the way, all 3 of the commentaries I brought happen to be in France. One of them is Rashi's grandson, but the other one just, again, happens to be in France, and they're all around the same century. So this is a rabbi known as Chizkuni, 13th century France. And Gloria, do you want to go ahead and take this short little source?
even though they were not among the 70 who were chosen, since the Spirit rested upon them and they prophesied.
So this kind of builds on Rashi. It's later than Rashi, so he clearly, not clearly, but I'm assuming if he lived in France, 100 years after Rashi, he read Rashi and that Midrash, and he basically said it's not just that they didn't make the cut. Everybody who was on that lottery had the ability. It's not that, and this is key, according to Chizkuni, you didn't have to show up to the initiation ceremony to get prophetic powers. Everyone in the lottery had the ability to speak for God. The ones who were chosen, though, were officially given the uniforms or the badge. So maybe that's why Yehoshua maybe was frustrated, assuming this, this midrash, is not that they had prophetic powers, but they were doing it without special permission. But regardless, that's why they were, so this doesn't explain the way they're left behind, but how they were able to prophesy is all of these men had the ability to speak for God, to have an ecstatic experience. They just weren't given the official position. They didn't get hired for the job, but they were great baseball players, computer programmers. There's one more classical rabbinic thing, and then we'll go on to a lovely article from a contemporary scholar. So this, and again, Leonard, I'll have you take this one. I won't have to go back and forth. This is Rashi's grandson, Rashbam, maternal grandson, I believe. And this is his suggestion about perhaps why Eldad and Medad didn't go with the rest of the people. And by the way, this one might imply that maybe of the 70 men chosen, maybe only 68 did show up. So go ahead, please, Leonard, of the ones.
Of the ones who had been invited in writing to come to the entrance of the tabernacle, we are told in Sanhedrin 17 that the reason these two men did not come to the entrance of the tabernacle was because they were too humble to want to be treated as special.
Excellent, thank you. So Rashbam imagines this a little bit differently than his grandfather. Here, it's not so much a lottery as it's kind of like an invitation to a party, and they decided not to go. Now, again, that might imply that there weren't 70 elders. Now, why that's problematic is these 70 elders become the model for something called the Sanhedrin. Sanhedrin is a Greek word. I don't recall the exact translation of it, but it's basically like a court of 70 men who sit around and they make, legal decisions, the big court decisions. Do we go to war, capital punishment, things like that, that they can decide, or capital punishment for the entire city. And he imagines that if this is true, that these two stayed behind, then it means there were only 68 official leaders of this big court. So that's a little bit troubling if that's what it implies. But they were invited, they should have gone up, become official, and they said, we don't deserve this, so we're going to stay behind. Now, it doesn't necessarily answer the question of why they were prophesying then. If they were so humble and they said, we don't deserve this honor, but yet they still stayed behind and did exactly what they were supposed to be doing, which is speaking on behalf of God, why didn't they make it official? And why is that a sign of humility? Moshe wasn't picking these people to put them up on a pedestal. He chose them to help do a job. So why did Eldad and Medad stay behind to do the job instead of going to get the badge? Because they said, badges? We don't need no stinking badges? I don't know. I don't know if people get that movie reference. But it doesn't really, it's a beautiful idea about humility and saying, I don't need the title to do the work. And maybe that's something to it. I don't need the title to do the work. Talk about someone like President Obama. I mean, this is oversimplifying his journey, but he was a community organizer. He was a community organizer, and he was able to do a great deal of work without being a senator or a president. Now, eventually, he did get into the title and continue to do work, regardless of what people think about him politically. But the whole point is someone can be really successful without a big, formal, fancy title. So before we go on to the last source, any questions up until now? And then we'll have time at the end. So this last source I'm really excited for, because one of the things I try and do, and I've said it a few times, is bring in scholars who are women, who happen to be women. And part of it is me actively going out of my way to find them. And part of it is unfortunately a general lack in comparison to certainly classical rabbis. But even today, there aren't as many women scholars as there could be. But I found one who wrote a beautiful article about this, Rabbi Dr. Behaalotecha. And I actually don't know who her husband is. And I was like, should I look it up? Doesn't even matter. But she's an observant Jew, lives in Israel, went to Bar Ilan University. She has a master's and a doctorate. And she wrote an article, and part of her article that I cut out summarized a lot of what we've read, but she had some beautiful notions into it. And again, brings it very much back home into what Eldad and Medad are saying, both about leadership and about how we connect to God. So this is from at least a selection of our article. From the very beginning, the relationship between the 70 elders and these two individuals is unclear. Were Eldad and Medad supposed to be members of that group? What is the process of prophecy, and what was special about their prophecy in the camp? Furthermore, while Yehoshua becomes upset and demands that Eldad and Medad be restrained, Moshe appears unperturbed. He's not annoyed by this. He's not troubled. It's in jest. Would that all the Lord's people were prophets, that the Lord put his spirit upon them. What is the point of disagreement between Moshe and Yehoshua? Why doesn't Moshe see Yehoshua's side? What was it that upset Yehoshua? What did Moshe see that led him to wish it on everyone? All of us, Rifki, Gloria, Leonard, we should all be prophets. The rabbinic sages viewed Eldad and Medad in a positive light. So they also rejected Yehoshua's claim. Everyone sees whatever they did in the camp as good. They're good people, suggesting they were modest individuals who chose to remain in the camp rather than join the elders in receiving godly spirit, which again, if they didn't receive the godly spirit, how were they prophets? Believing themselves to be unworthy of such greatness. And this is a quote from the Talmud. The Holy One, blessed be he, said, since you have made yourselves humble, I will add greatness to your greatness. So the explanation is, how did they get prophecy? If they had shown up for Moshe to be one of the 70, they would have got it then. But because they said, we don't deserve this, God said, I'm going to give it to you anyways, because I love how humble you are. That's more important to me than the title, is that all you care about is serving the people. And we'll come back to that. It's not about the title. It's about doing the good work. And God says, I'm going to give you powers. Was there reluctance to participate solely due? Just hold on for one quick moment. Sorry, just one. So sorry about that. Was there reluctance to participate solely due to their modesty, their belief that they were undeserving? The disagreement about the status of the prophecy of Eldad and Medad is closely connected with the content of that prophecy. So at this point, she lists the different midrashic prophecies. It's not so relevant to this final point she makes. So one of those three prophecies, and again, we have no idea what they said, but one of them is that they might have been talking about a future war between these two nations that leads to the end of times, and the Mashiach will come back and God's presence will be known on earth, Garden of Eden. So based on that prophecy, we go now to the Talmud, where Rav Nachman says they were prophesying about the matter of Gog and Magog. Now, jumping ahead to the 19th century or 20th century in Germany, Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch discusses Rav Nachman's statement in some detail. 19th century. He suggests that the wars of Gog and Magog described in the books of Yechezkel, Ezekiel, and Zechariah are the final developments in world history. According to meaning, like I said, after that war, that's it. History as we know it ends. It's not the end of the universe. It's just the march of history ends and we just live in paradise with God. We don't need to be having wars or machines or anything. We just chill with God. According to Yechezkel, the change that is expected at the end of times is the birth of a city that is based on the simplicity of the wisdom of the masses. So he'll say more about that, or she'll say more about this. But the idea there is, instead of having, Boston as a city with so many intellectuals, everyone looks to there, everyone looks to New York or San Francisco as the leading cities, and people want to move there, or there are cities and countries fighting about who has the right philosophy, who has the right government, communism, capitalism, everyone fighting about that. You're just going to have a city where people will just be and live, and you're not going to fight over Karl Marx versus Heidegger versus all the philosophers and historians. It's just going to be the people just being together and saying, good morning, join me for tea. Let's just relax together. It's not about the leaders guiding history, just people being present in the moment. And unfortunately, that's not the way the world works. It's a few people at the top controlling history and fighting and causing all of these wars. There's this incredible song by, I think it's in the 60s or 70s, a singer Donovan, called Universal Soldier. Beautiful, painful song. And it basically argues that every war is not fought by the Stalins and the Hitlers, it's fought by the soldiers who are willing to go along with orders. Now that's unfair to a lot of these soldiers, but at the end of the day, these soldiers will do what they're told, but it's not their war. It's these leaders at the top who sometimes are righteous and they're fighting a war that needs to be fought. And sometimes they're evil, but why can't the soldiers decide what they want to do for themselves? That's what it means to just have the wisdom of the masses. We're not going to listen to these dictatorial, autocratic leaders telling us this is what we need to do. Just be present in the moment. So Torah will no longer be the sole possession of unique individuals, and a recognition of God will no longer belong to a narrow elite group. And she brings in this fascinating thing. This clarifies why the rabbinic sages chose to connect God, and I think it's supposed to be Gog and Magog with Eldad and Medad, and why they were the ones chosen to share the prophecy of spiritual privatization. Here's what she's saying. The 70 elders were so important to help Moshe lead, but they were off over here, becoming official political positions, senators, etc., like that, and governors. Well, where were Eldad and Medad bringing the word of God? Right amongst the people. Everyone can do this. You don't need to be a senator or a governor to do the right thing. According to this midrash, Eldad and Medad refused to allow themselves to be appointed to a high position, one that carried with it power and influence. They preferred to remain within the camp. By means of their actions, they expressed the ideals of the utopian victory of the masses. The redemption that they promise will transfer power from the ruling elite to the people, exactly what I was trying to say before. This idea can be used to explain the connection between the incident of Eldad and Medad and their prophecy that Moshe will die. This is one of the other prophecies, and Yoshua will replace him. Their prophecy made clear that God resides in the midst of the Jewish people. This implies that the nation does not really need Moshe as leader. Everyone thinks Moshe is a god. Once Moshe is done, we're gone. No, anyone can be a Moshe. As soon as Moshe dies, because he's just a man, someone can take over. So why can't you take over? It can continue on its path even without him. No man or woman is irreplaceable. The national destiny can be filled under a different leader. I'm going to skip these next two paragraphs, but basically it brings a more contemporary from the 16th century about this rabbi using our story of Eldad and Medad, saying that there are these elite Torah scholars, these chilukim, who the Torah is in their hands, and the people say, oh, we don't need to know Torah because the elites, the PhDs are going to take care of it. And he says that's horrible. Torah is for everybody. We should not limit it only to these elite people. So I'll just go to now her last paragraph. One would suggest that Moshe's leadership was one of several possible models that could have been appropriate for his time, meaning having one leader who everyone looks to. But the role of God, who can interact directly with the people without intermediaries, must be considered as well. Again, I'm hired as rabbi. I like when people come to me for rabbinic questions. But could most people figure out these things on their own? Are the resources out there in English and online? Yes, don't put me out of a job. But the reality is most people can access God and Torah democratically and universally, and it's beautiful, and that is a good thing. They say, has the Lord spoken only through Moshe? Has he not spoken through us as well? Rab Tzadok writes, they smelled from afar that in the future a new reality would exist. According to Rab Tzadok, with what Eldad and Medad experienced came before its time, and it offers information about what will be at the end of days. At that time, the burden of bringing divine abundance to the nation and the entire world will rest not only on Moshe, but on the strength of Aharon and the strength of Miriam, because God will exhibit himself in a pure manner. Would that all the Lord's people were prophets. So Moshe's prayer for us is, it's nice to have leaders that can help guide a people, but at the end of the day, you can be a leader too. You do not need to rely only on one single man or one single woman. Everyone can fully and completely access